Hey, everybody. Welcome to the Integrity Restored podcast. I'm Jim O'Day, your host, and I'm blessed to be joined today by a new friend, Rachael Killackey. Rachael is the author of a book called Love in Recovery. And Rachael is the founder and executive director of Magdala Ministries, which helps women find hope and healing from sexual addiction. This is huge, ladies and gentlemen, because this has been a silent problem in our society and in our church. And we'll talk more about that. Rachael earned her bachelor's and master's degree in theology from Ave Maria University, and she's pursuing a certification in sex addiction therapy from Mid America Nazarene University. That's the SATP program,
Yeah.
ladies and gentlemen, which we recommend often. She's worked in the Diocese of Nashville as a director of faith formation, and she's been a guest on various podcasts, including Lust is Boring with Jason Everett, Pints with Aquinas with Matt Fradd, the Covenant Eyes podcast, Wide Open Spaces, Wellness Wednesday, and Edify, and now the Integrity Restored podcast. Welcome, Rachael. So great to have you.
Thank you, Jim. So good to be with you.
What a blessing, and what bravery. I want to ask you a question. This book, Love and Recovery, great read, by the way, ladies and gentlemen. And I'm not a woman, but it was a great read. So I would recommend it to all our listeners to understand the scope of this problem. How long did it take you to write this, Rachael?
I started writing in November, December of 2021 and finished the final edits by October of 2022. So almost a year.
Yeah, it's not an easy thing to accomplish. And right on the back of your book, there was a quote that just made so much sense to me. And it says, so often, freedom begins simply in hearing a story that sounds like ours. Isolation feeds addictions. Communion starves them. I desperately needed a woman to share their story when I was a teenager and young adult. A story that sounded like the one I kept silent for too long. In this book, I'm offering you a story, whether or not you need it, like I did. Nothing truer. I've never read anything truer, Rachael. All addictions are fed in isolation. This addiction in particular, and even more in particular when it comes to women struggling with sexual addictions. So take me back to when you first started struggling with pornography and masturbation.
Yeah. So masturbation is not a huge part of my story, but pornography is. Pornography was the primary kind of mode of my sexual addiction and unwanted behavior. I was first exposed to porn when I was 13, which is statistically actually a little late, as I'm sure you know.
Nowadays, yep, for sure.
Yeah, average age is 11 for girls and 9 for boys. So I was 13 and exposed through social media. It was on a family device that my parents monitored. But I learned how to get around kind of their monitoring, and I kept on consuming. And I struggled throughout high school and then until I was a sophomore in college. So I was 19 when I entered kind of a long-term sobriety.
Wow. And how did you find that sobriety? Did you do counseling? Did you have an accountability partner? Increase in the spiritual life? What was your...
Definitely increase in the spiritual life. There was a spiritual element to it, just breaking an agreement with pornography's presence in my life, kind of surrendering it over to the Lord. Because I think throughout those high school years and early on in college, I was kind of white knuckling and trying to recover by myself. And I thought the Lord kind of wanted nothing to do with this part of my life. And it was finally when I surrendered that over and realized he wanted everything to do with it. He wanted to be right in the middle of that recovery with me, that I started seeing some positive changes. I also had to get rid of my smartphone for a while that was a huge thing for me.
Right.
I didn't take advantage of too many blocking softwares or things like that. Rather, I chose to just get rid of the smartphone for a little while in exchange for a little flip phone. That was really, really helpful. And then starting to tell my story to other women and kind of come alongside them in their own walk, but also bring friends alongside me. And that proved to be so pivotal. And then I pursued therapy later on in my recovery. So a couple years
Mhm.
into recovery, um, is when I started to really unpack sort of those early childhood wounds that had fed into my struggle with pornography. That was when I began to unpack those.
It's really interesting because there's no perfect path to
No.
recovery that I've learned.
Yeah.
Here at Integrity Restored, we have what we call, my listeners know this, I say it all the time, the three pillars. All right. What are the three pillars that we support for recovering from this problem or helping someone recover? Sorry. That is strong scientific therapy and counseling,
Hmm.
understanding what's really going on in your brain and your body,
Yeah.
an increase in the spiritual life, frequent reception of the sacraments, which can be
Yeah.
very healing, and spiritual direction. And then finally, community and accountability.
Yeah.
And those are the three pillars. And what's interesting to me is that in your recovery journey, you did all three of those pillars,
Yeah.
right? You
Yes.
increased your spiritual life. You put a focus on Jesus in your recovery. You
Hmm.
you reached out to other people. You built a community. And then
Hmm.
you took advantage of therapy to get to those deeper wounds. This
Hmm.
really works, ladies and gentlemen. It really does work. So um, when you think back to that first time you reached out to somebody,
Hmm.
said, "Hey, this is what I'm doing. This is what I'm struggling with."
Yeah.
How did that go?
Yeah. The first person I really told in depth was my best friend in high school. She's still uh, one of my closest friends. And she did not have anything with unwanted sexual behavior, sexual addiction in her story, but she received me with so much mercy and so much love. Um, and it actually was kind of an anticlimactic conversation. I thought maybe it would be a bigger deal than it was, but she was just like, "Thank you for telling me. Like, I love you, and God loves you." And it just wasn't. It didn't change her vision of me, which actually was perhaps the most healing reaction, was to be
Mhm.
just received um, and realize that it didn't change our relationship. It didn't change her view of me, because I think that was the thought in the back of my mind, is if I reveal this, everybody's going to see me as some sort of anomaly, or worse, some sort of monster.
Mm.
But she received me with so much love, and yeah, that was how that went. And then when I first kind of publicly shared, um, I talk about this in my book, but I was a Young Life leader, so I shared at Young Life camp for this cardboard testimony activity. And that was received so beautifully as well. My team was so supportive. The teens that I was serving were so supportive, but then a lot of the Young Life staff were just really supportive as well. And one man came up to me and just took my hand, and he just said, "You have no idea what you've done today. You have no idea the chains
Amen
that
to
you
that.
broke today." And I didn't. I had no idea, but he asked me. He was like, "Please don't stop talking about this." And
Right.
that was a really beautiful, just kind of entreaty of the work that I do now. And yeah, so I've always been pretty graciously and beautifully received, which isn't every woman's story. I was just hearing a woman's story yesterday about her being poorly, poorly, poorly received by a priest in confession. Like that's
Mhm.
regular, right? So I've been very blessed to have mostly
Mhm.
good, merciful experiences.
One of the hmm, one of the challenges we have as church, that we have to recognize,
Mm,
our priests are not trained in seminary how to deal
no,
with this problem.
no,
This is a relatively new phenomenon, and a lot of our priests, particularly of a certain age and older, when they think of a pornography addiction, they think of a man looking at a Playboy magazine, or they
Hmm.
think of if it's really, really gone far, a man going to massage parlors or prostitutes,
Yeah.
or a they used to have, I remember in New York City growing up, like movie theaters where they would show
Hmm.
X-rated
Yeah.
movies, and you think of the guy in the trench coat, right, with the hat, so nobody sees who he is. It's a whole different world today.
Yeah.
And so we have to pray for our priests. And one of the things we're doing, Rachel, I'm going to ask for your prayers and for all the listeners' prayers, is we are building an online training program for priests, uh,
Oh, praise God.
to
Yeah.
help them deal with this in their ministries, um, in the confessional, in spiritual direction, in sacramental
Hmm.
prep, and it's going to be so important for our clergy to have this. Um, in your first chapter, what I've highlighted a bunch of stuff in the book. We're not going to get to all of it, but your book has a lot of highlights now. But one of
Mhm.
the things that really struck me that I thought we had to speak about was, um, first chapter beginning. What does this talk about again? Porn addiction, her friend replied. The first woman looked at me and then whispered back, but she's a girl.
Yeah.
Wow. There's so many of our beautiful young women today are struggling, and they're struggling in silence. And if a man has shame and guilt, it's triple for a woman,
Mm.
or
Mm.
quadruple, or 10 times. I don't even know. I'm not a woman. Um,
Mm.
because they unfortunately falsely believe that this is just a man's problem.
Yeah. Yeah.
Can you talk about that for a minute?
Oh gosh. Yeah, that deserves an episode all on its own, right? Like I
And
think
maybe we'll do one.
maybe we'll do one. I think there are many things that contributed to this misunderstanding, right? And I think the first one would be that the porn industry did originally target men. They saw that their primary audience, their primary consumers were men. You were just mentioning Playboy and things like that. Yes, women were not um, as drawn in by that kind of content. But when video pornography and written pornography really took off and that industry really took off, it absolutely attracted women as well. Um, I hear a lot of misconceptions about women in consumption. Like, I mean, all the time. I address them regularly, but one of the biggest ones that I hear is that men are visual, women are emotional. So women want romance and men want porn, right? And women are absolutely drawn in by the romantic, and sometimes that's even a gateway to pornography. I know
Yep.
that was a gateway to my consumption. Um, but there's a lot of interesting scientific studies out there about this. But one of my favorites that I found to be most telling, and I cite it in my book, was two female psychologists screened men and women. They showed them the same visual pornographic content and then asked them afterward what they attributed their arousal to. And men said the attractiveness of the people in the video, and women said their ability to imagine themselves as somebody in the video. So they're attracted to the same content for and the same visual content, but for
Mm-hmm.
different reasons through different modes. Women have this
Right.
intermediary of the fantasy, the imaginary life that men don't seem to have as much. Like a high concentration of women that we serve in Magdala are either currently or have just struggled with intense sexual fantasy, whether or not
Yep.
they're still consuming porn. It's a common problem for them, and it was
And
for
and
me as
and
well.
it's interesting because, um, in order to reach orgasm,
Hmm.
men don't need that fantasy.
Hmm.
But for women, and not 100% of the time. I mean, this is a
Hmm.
broad brush straight statement, but for a lot of women, in order to get fulfillment from the pornography, they do put themselves in there. It's
Yeah.
that fantasy connection. So I think that's very
Hmm.
important. Um,
Yeah, absolutely. And in a way that makes it even more insidious. And I
Deeper,
would, yeah,
deeper.
yeah, pornographic content inserts itself into women's psyches in a very different way than it
Yep.
inserts itself into the male brain. And so, um, That's one of the biggest misconceptions I think, is that porn was not attractive to women or is not attractive to women. And statistically, that is just incredibly false. I mean,
Mhm.
one study that I was recently looking at said that 90% of men admit to consuming porn in the last month when surveyed, and 60% of women did. So
Right.
that statistical gap is really closing. Um,
Yeah,
and I,
because as recently as 10, 15 years ago,
mhm.
the number for women was 3-4% that would admit
Yes,
it. I mean, I do think at that point, even then, more women were doing it, but
sure,
that
yeah,
would admit it was 3 and 4%. Now, because of society, because of culture, it's so accepted that more and more women are admitting it. More and more women,
totally.
therefore, are struggling.
Totally. Yeah. And I think in the church too, we could only respond to the information we had at the time. But I
Mm.
know that that kind of dug the narrative in deeper. Because growing up, I heard nothing about women potentially struggling with
Right,
pornography.
right,
I heard about men struggling. There were all sorts of there were good chastity messages that I received, and there were also really really poorly articulated ones. I think again coming from a good place, but very infused by purity culture. I spent an entire chapter talking about the harms of purity culture, especially on women, in my book for that reason, is because we're still kind of dealing with a lot of these purity culture influenced messages. But the fact that women could not struggle with pornography was one
right,
of them,
right.
and masturbation as well, and all of these unwanted sexual behaviors. Because I think a
Well,
lot of our chastity messages for men were geared towards that, and they almost had permission or the expectation that they would struggle. And women, we would just get talks about modesty or emotional chastity, which are good things, right? But it was almost like the church or these church voices at times just thought teenage girls and young adult women were asexual and not
yeah,
having desire at all.
not
Yeah.
sexual creatures. It makes no sense. I mean,
Yeah.
God made
Yeah.
us that way. I remember growing up. I laugh about it all the time. If if you masturbate, you're going to hell. Uh,
Mm.
if you masturbate, you're going to get hair on your palms, and
Oh.
all this stupid stuff. Instead of telling us the science, what is
Mm.
happening when
Mhm.
you're watching pornography and masturbating, or just masturbating with fantasy. Um,
Mhm.
there's certain things that are happening that are not beneficial. And I
Yeah.
think if we talk to young people about the science, and maybe for the initial conversations leave the morality out of it, we're going to get
Mhm.
a lot further.
Yeah, I think there's absolutely a role for that. I also think it could potentially decrease some of the embarrassment and shame around this. And I think
Mhm.
we should have guilt about doing sinful things, right? So I'm not talking about guilt that leads to repentance. I'm talking about shame. Um, like you called me brave at the beginning of this interview, which is very gracious of you to say. But it's so funny because I don't feel that way because so many women are struggling. I feel kind of like one of the pack now. So
Right.
it's, but I think the more we can increase that feeling of like, this is just a human struggle, it's
Yes.
really common. And there's no shame in admitting it. And so there's not necessarily bravery in coming forward either. And again, you're being very gracious, but that's kind of the vision that I hope for in the church, is that this is no longer seen as um, this sort of yeah, I guess I want to say brave thing to do, but rather that it's just a human thing to do, is to talk about this topic.
Well, one of the things, I mean, I travel all over the country and talk to all kinds of groups, priests,
Yeah.
parents, individuals, teens. Um, I always say we need to stop looking at this as a moral failing and start looking at
Mm,
it for the true addiction that it really is. And if we were in church, Rachel, and you and I are standing after Mass on a Sunday and we're chatting, and somebody came up and said, "Hey, I'm struggling with alcohol, I'm struggling with drugs," we'd have
mm,
people jumping over the pews to help them.
yeah. Yeah.
If that same person came up and said, "Hey, I'm struggling with sexual addiction, porn addiction, whatever," everybody puts down their eyes and walks away. That
Hmm.
has to stop. And
Yeah.
and your book, Love in Recovery, is a step in that direction. So God
Thank
bless you
you.
for that.
Thank
Um,
you.
one of the other quotes in your book, I'm not sure. I've got to look at what chapter it is. Chapter 3. Um, Not only is sexual suppression and abuse eroticized for men through pornography, but it's also eroticized for women, a phenomenon that is perhaps unique and definitely detrimental to our culture. I
Mhm.
think this is really important. We kind of just touched on it a minute ago, but men's and women's brains respond the same way to eroticism.
Mhm.
God made us that way. And
Mhm.
and we need to start talking like that, especially to our young women,
Thank
whether
you.
they're
Yeah.
in our families, in our friends groups, in our youth groups. We've got to bring a level of understanding what these kids in particular are facing today. I didn't grow up with
Mhm.
that. I'm a lot older than you. Um, but girls were struggling then too, I'm sure. Maybe not with
Absolutely.
pornography to the level, but other lust issues, let's say.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And it's been interesting even within Magdala's work. We serve adult women of all ages, and our highest concentration of participants probably, I mean, it falls between 18 and I'd say 30, 35. But we
Mhm.
have a high concentration of women in their 40s and 50s and even 60s and 70s that are coming in. And
Absolutely.
these are married women with children. These are religious sisters. These are single women. These are women in college like this. And we serve women in 37 countries and counting. So this is a global issue for women, and women in all vocations. It's not just in the U.S. It's not just in our colleges. This is everywhere. And
Everywhere.
I think the more and more we can kind of let that sink into our minds that uh, it's not just the future mothers and religious sisters and workers of God's vineyard. Like it's the mothers now, it's the wives now, it's
Praise
the
God.
religious sisters now, it's the women who are serving in amazing careers and serving the church right now. Like
Yep.
this is a very present and active struggle all over the globe.
Yeah. Yeah. Great time to. Where do people find more information about Magdala Ministries?
Yeah, so we don't have social media as an organization just due to it kind of being a massive gateway for women struggling, but you can find all of our information at magdalaministries.org. So if you're a woman who's struggling with sexual addiction of any kind or just trying to heal from a past sexual addiction, you can join a small group. We have virtual small groups, so they're very easily accessed. If you are interested in bringing Magdala to your college campus, or you're a campus minister or chaplain looking to bring Magdala to your college campus for an in person group for your students, we have opportunity for that as well,
Hmm.
that you can sign up for on our site. You can also inquire about bringing an in person group to your parish. So we have three different types of groups. And then if you're a woman who has recovered from this and received a lot of healing in her own story, you can volunteer to be a small group moderator. We're always looking
Awesome.
for women to lead groups, because, yeah, our wait list is typically an average of 200 to 300 women long. So we try to
Wow.
get through that as quickly as possible just to have it kind of replaced again. So we're
Yep.
always looking for more leaders. And also, we're always in need of financial support. So if people feel called to financially support us, we're a nonprofit. We run off of people's generosity. You can find the links on our site as well.
MagdalaMinistries.org. Um, and we'll put those that address in the show notes as well.
Awesome.
So here's one of the things I wanted to in the last few minutes we have here from your book again. This really struck me because, and by the way, this is not only for women. This is for men too.
Mm-hmm.
If you're caught in a life of fantasy, chances are you've noticed it affecting other areas of your life. Maybe it's manifesting as shorter attention span, brain fog, or the inability to truly focus and be present in your daily life. This is more real than real, ladies and gentlemen. Uh, Social media drives this, pornography drives this,
Yeah.
television and music drive this. Um, Talk to our listeners for a minute. How do you break free from that? Because I think many of us, even if we've got the porn addiction under control, still struggle with this in other areas of our life.
Mm, gosh. Yeah, I'd say for lack of a better term, a core value of my family, like my spouse and I, is to live in reality. That's kind of a thing that we're consistently focused on together, is how do we live more deeply in tune with reality. Um, I think you listed a ton of obstacles to that.
Yeah.
Social media and technology, perhaps, being the biggest. And we live in a technological, a digital age, right? So we can't avoid these things. But goodness, we have to be curbing them. Because
Hmm.
what frightens me is how quickly we open our arms to these new technologies, and how quickly it's like, let's find the good in them. And it's like, well, sometimes they just shouldn't be touched, and that's okay to say, right? But I get branded as a Luddite a lot because of saying stuff like that. But I think social media is far, far, far more destructive than it is helpful, even for people who are trying to use it for good. I find it to be a very destructive medium. So I think it absolutely robs us of presence, but also just how easily accessed entertainment is. I think that's something to examine in our lives, right? And especially if we're struggling with not
Yeah.
living in tune with reality and not having peace, a peaceful presence in our day. Henry Nouwen talks about how entertainment, when the Latin root word of it is, I think, is tenare, which is to be in between, like to suspend. So the word entertainment comes from roots that mean to suspend in between or to keep in between. So you can think about the entertainment that you're pursuing, whether pornographic or not, right, or fantasy or not.
Mhm.
You can think about it as it's keeping you between this fantasy life and this real life. And so examine that entertainment, and what role does it have in your life? Are you binging on Netflix? Do you constantly have to have noise in the background, even if it's a
Right.
podcast or music? Or are you able to just be actively present in what's going through your day? Are you slow? Are you intentional? Um, or do you feel like you're kind of living in between? And if you are, maybe start eliminating things one by one, or just kind of subduing its presence. It's so real. We're all in the midst of that battle, all of
Yeah.
us, every day.
No, absolutely, absolutely. And I think it's important to recognize that
Yeah.
these companies, they're not the size they are because they
Mm-mm.
haven't figured out how to keep us locked in. They have figured
Absolutely.
it out. And it's going to be
Absolutely.
up to us as individuals to determine what's right in our life. So I think
Mm.
that's a really, really strong statement. Rachael, this has been an incredible conversation. Once again, I thank you so much. And I do want to have you on again. I'd like to make this a regular conversation for women
Oh, I would
who
love
are
that.
struggling.
Yeah.
So that would be completely awesome. Ladies and gentlemen, please go to magdalaministries.org for more information on Rachael and her work. And where will they get a copy of this book, Rachael?
Yes, please order the book. I wrote it for everyone, just everyone who's trying to address this topic for women, whether you have daughters, or you're a priest, or you're in ministry, or you're a psychologist, or you're a dad. I wrote it for everyone. You can go to Ave Maria Press. That's who it's published through. You can get a copy there, or it's available on all major booksellers and websites like Amazon and things like that.
Yeah. So, Love in Recovery. Again, this will be in the show notes. Love in Recovery, ladies and gentlemen. Rachael, thank you so much for being with us on this episode, and we'll have you back soon again.
Awesome. Thank
Ladies,
you, Jim.
you're welcome. Ladies and gentlemen, thanks as always for listening, and may God bless your journey.